So I'm not sure exactly where we got cut off, but I'll bring you back in on some
Oh,
reason.
no.
I think it was right after. Oh, we are live now. I think we're back on. So we apologize. Technical difficulties. You can blame me. I'm a historian, not an IT person. For some reason, the Wi-Fi down here in South Florida decided to go kapunk. So I'm not sure where he lost, but I think unfortunately we're going to have to make Jim and his bow tie restart from there. I think we got George's. We had some comments from about George, and then when Jim started talking, it went. I think you were just too smart, Jim, and it just cut it.
I seriously doubt that was the issue.
Yeah. But thank you all. I apologize for all those who we cut out, but I think we are back. We're back. Okay, thank you. So thanks, John, Vanessa, for letting me know we are back on. So do you want to have you repeat it, Jim? Would you mind sharing that wisdom one more time with us?
Sure. So I was playing off of 2 points that George made. One was the professionalization of the United States Army, and the second was the focus of the United States. I would argue that the United States Army, as we know it today, is born on the plains of Chippewa in 1814, during the long, brutal winter of 1813 to 1814, as Winfield Scott is whipping his first brigade into shape. It's the War of 1812, which really serves as the reminder to the United States that they must maintain a professional standing army, an officer and NCO corps that can be expanded and built upon with volunteers in times of crisis. You know, after the American Revolution, after the professionalization of the Continental Army during Valley Forge, the army is done away with, and you have the arguments throughout successive administrations of you know, the threat of a standing army. How big should the military establishment be? Oh, we'll rely on the militia. And the War of 1812 proved the lie, that you can't rely on a standing militia. As good as they are in several battles during the War of 1812, you have to have a professional standing army with professionally trained NCOs and officers. West Point exists before the War of 1812, but it's an engineering school. After this, you see a change. And then the second point is, from the establishment of the United States through the Treaty of Ghent in 1815, the focus of the United States is across the Atlantic. It's what is happening between Great Britain and France around the globe that is drawing the United States in, and how they avoid or negotiate those conflicts. And it's also north to Canada, the British colony, that Americans and British colonists alike have an understanding after the American Revolution that this is not going to continue. These two nations cannot peacefully coexist, because their definition of democracy and representative government is so radically different to them. And the War of 1812 ends external threats to the existence and independence of the United States, and allows the United States to then look internally and focus its gaze on westward expansion and all of the internal conflicts that's going to inflame.
Okay. Well, great summary. Now we won't make you do it a third time, I promise. Only twice. So, and Dan, carry out that important War of 1812. That one thing people should know.
Yeah, I think it goes back to something that Jim mentioned as far as the country looking westward. They look westward for their from a political perspective. One of the biggest name that comes out of the War of 1812 is Andrew Jackson. Jackson's a Westerner. He's a transplanted North Carolinian, South Carolinian who eventually settles in West Tennessee. And he comes out of the War of 1812 as the military hero of the United States. And he's on a platform that had previously been held by George Washington. And America's, I think to a certain degree, was looking for a hero. And Jackson uses that military capital that he had built up to launch himself to the White House 14 years after his famous victory at New Orleans. And he in turn launches the Age of Jackson, the Age of the Common Man, And those ideals tend to carry America through the 1820s into the 1830s, and even play more so into the sectional crisis that begins to arise following the War with Mexico. And if there's one person that comes out of the War of 1812 that anybody should know about, it's Andrew Jackson. And there's no other person that really beyond Winfield Scott influences the American military, but also influences American politics in what becomes a very, very pivotal 2 to 3 decades leading up to the Civil War.
So that we actually have now that we have the gauntlet laid of Andrew Jackson, the one person someone should know out of the War of 1812. I guess I'll wade in since it was my question and say you also have kind of an emergence also of the U.S. Navy. Initially, the Barbary Coast War, you have some of these naval captains coming of age. There's actually, I think, a small monument on the U.S. Naval Academy campus for the Barbary Coast. But even the Park Service protects one of the sites up in Ohio. John Hazel, a faithful follower, has mentioned that as well. But you also have, something that is the government takes forward is how easily Washington, D.C. is taken. And then, okay, how do we stop that from happening? You have these major effort of the tiered forts and so forth. But of course, the one most famous Fort McHenry had been, of course, established beforehand. Besides that, you have the War of the Navy, you have the creating of this permanent kind of army. We have a initial question from Vanessa Smiley. I'll throw this out to the group, is how much of a shockwave was it, if at all, for the U.S. government to realize at this time that they needed a permanent military force, Army, Navy, etc.? Is there any vibrations through the halls of Congress?
Yeah, I think so. In 1806, Thomas Jefferson is working on getting through the Embargo Act. There's all these various things that lead up to the War of 1812. And one of the things that the United States government attempts to do to bring France and Great Britain to heel is to say, well, we're just not going to trade with you. Unfortunately, while that becomes the law, there are many major ports throughout the North that say, yeah, well, we're not really gonna follow that, and so they don't shut down the ports, which leads to the passing of the 1807 Insurrection Act, which empowers the federal government to use the regular United States military in situations where the laws of the United States are not being enforced. And this was because in these ports and in these towns and in these states, the local authorities and the governors are not calling out the state militia to enforce that. So therein lies one of the issues with the state militia, and thus the importance of a professional standing army, is that the militia is an inherently political animal. From the election of officers and companies and regiments to the appointing of its officers at the brigade division level. And then at the state, so if you have a state governor that doesn't agree with the administration, they will not call out the militia. And indeed, that happened throughout the War of 1812. When President Madison made the call, there were a few governors who said, no, not going to do it. And I think that was a very important lesson that Congress took away after the war.
Mm-hmm. I think kind of adding on what Jim said, it's a slow burn. It definitely picks up the pace during the War of 1812 because you are in a pitched war, but it's a slow burn. During the Washington administration, during the Articles of Confederation period, the 1780s, you do have a very teeny tiny minuscule excuse of a standing army. It's there, but it's not really worth talking about. It mans a couple forts and has a barracks in New Jersey, if the few details I remember, and then like 75% of it gets killed on the Wabash. And then you have in the 1790s the Legion of the United States, kind of a reformed U.S. Army under Anthony Wayne, and that stays. It's not huge, but it's for America at the time a decent sized standing force. And then it continues to the Adams administration. We go almost a war with France. We raise a bigger army that involves some Navy fights here or there, but then Jefferson becomes the president, and he basically slashes what army there was into nothing. And then you have the Chesapeake Leopard affair in 1808, and Jefferson kind of forced into rebuilding the army a little bit. It's still not very big. A lot of the regiments he raises are under strength. By the beginning of the War of 1812, it has, most people seem to say 7,000. The highest estimate I've seen is 10,000, and I'm leaning more toward the 7,000 number myself. And then at the end of the War of 1812, although the army itself is quickly reduced back to a much smaller size, there is this strong realization of we need to beef up West Point, get out better quality officers. There is an effort to greatly improve the training of the professional troops on the field. And I mean, Winfield Scott's on this big panel. Jim mentioned him earlier to kind of redo how the Army is trained. They come out with a brand new manual that, with only a few minor changes, remains the standard until the 1850s, when you start seeing rifles become the primary arm as opposed to muskets.
I was going to say, George, I think the key is not the size of the peacetime army, but what that professionalization means. And I think for me, after the War of 1812, it's consistency. It's seeing generals like Winfield Scott, who started the war as a captain, ended the war as a brigadier general, carrying through with the army all the way up until the Civil War. Jacob Brown continuing in the American Army. Your naval heroes, for, while there were standing armies, between the American Revolution and the War of 1812, you had so much changeover within the officer corps. You had multiple overhauls of the army itself and its organization, its administration, to how is it even supplied? And it's those things that after the War of 1812, I think carry on. The logistics, the administrative side of things, and then the individuals, that go on to remain in the Army for 10, 20, 30 years, or the Navy that start as captains and end up as admirals, that really professionalize and maintain that institutional knowledge for the decades to come.
Yeah, and I think also that part of it too is also necessity. We talked about a little bit about how America looks westward after the War of 1812, and as America expands beyond the Mississippi River, there becomes a question of, okay, well, who is going to accompany these settlers westward? Who's going to patrol these new roads? Who's going to build these new roads? Who's going to garrison these new forts along those routes? And I think part of it too also becomes as a necessity when you start seeing many of the dragoon regiments that are being formed in the early 1830s, mid 1830s. So I think it's a combination of some of the other many of the other factors we've already discussed.
Now, Dan, I'd like to take real quick, if it's okay, Philip. I wanted to take an opportunity to throw out who I think most Americans should remember from the War of 1812. And it's a young man who, ironically enough, is a civilian, so he's not a military hero. I think Jackson gets enough credit for winning the Battle of New Orleans, becoming president. Everyone's always going to remember him. But there is a very nondescript grave in Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. for a government clerk by the name of Stephen Pleasanton. And this young man took it upon himself to save as much of the government records as he could. And it's to Stephen Pleasanton whom we owe eternal gratitude for saving the Declaration of Independence. The Secretary of War walked by, saw what he was doing and said, "Why are you bothering doing this? The British aren't going to be coming to Washington." And, I think he was 27, 28 at the time. And he's being ridiculed by the Secretary of War. I would think most civil servants or government clerks would perhaps take pause at having a cabinet level official upbraid them. But he's, after, the Secretary of War walked on, he continued. And if not for him, there would be an empty frame at the National Archives. So Stephen Pleasanton, go visit him at the Congressional Cemetery.
I like that. I want to build on that because we got a question on what from Mark Malloy, the biggest villain from the War of 1812. Of course, he also said greatest hero, and we kind of answered that. I mean, the Secretary of War for the United States government, is it John Armstrong? I know it's Armstrong. I forget his first name. But I mean, yeah, he doesn't think Washington, D.C. is going to be captured. He actually is replaced by Madison, I believe, right? Because Monroe would be one of the only cabinet officers that takes over 2 roles. And I think Madison is actually one of only 2 presidents shot at in time of war at the Bladensburg, the Battle of Bladensburg, or the Bladensburg races. So, I mean, greatest. So we do greatest villains. We get out all the softball questions first. So we have the greatest greatest villain. I do want to say it's amazing that we have the professionalizing of the U.S. military, but I mean, from a native Marylander, the battle that we remember beside Fort McHenry is the Battle of North Point. The reason I remember that is I actually had an ancestor in the Baltimore militia that got called up and fought there. I know he wasn't the one that shot Robert Ross because we're not that good of a shot, but and then of course New Orleans with what Jackson's able to do there. But so leading that, the biggest villain, we have one comment that said it's Admiral Cockburn would be the biggest villain of the War of 1812.
Well, that depends on your perspective. There were 4,000 enslaved African Americans in the Chesapeake Bay who saw Cockburn as a little savior. If not for Cockburn and the British Navy in 1813 and 1814, they would not have been able to take their freedom and resettle in Canada, the Caribbean, or as several hundred of them did, actually enlist in the British Armed Forces and fight against their former enslavers. So it all hinges on how you define villain and what side you're on. Certainly from an American perspective, Cockburn, or Coburn as the British pronounced it, but Cockburn as we Americans did, receives the lion's share of that approbation. I would have to say Armstrong. Of all the quote unquote villains of the War of 1812, I think he's the one who resists rehabilitation the most by historians, because he just does such a terrible job of preparing the nation in 1813 and 1814 for invasion. When he appoints Winder to look over DC and Maryland, he sends his official communications to Winder not by courier, not by military courier, but by dropping it in the mail. So there is something to Armstrong's personality as well as his ability that just makes him the villain, in my estimation.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Jim on that, and just put that within context to everybody. You know, stop and think about that. Here is a president who sacks his Secretary of War in the midst of war, an armed conflict. It's something you really can't see, despite the turnover that Lincoln had. You really can't see an Abraham Lincoln replacing an Edwin Stanton in the course of the Civil War. So just to underscore that point a little bit about how inept Armstrong was.
But it was Armstrong, the War of 1812, Simon Cameron, that if he could get him to like Russia, he would have sent Armstrong off to Russia if he could.
Probably.
Yeah. But no, I mean, yeah, it's unheard of. And I mean, the change, as Lincoln says, change a horse in midstream or whatever the saying is. Let's stay away from the Civil War, the recent unpleasantness. Yeah. George, you got a villain or even a hero? We'll take it either way.
Well, I think, starting with the villain, since that's what we're on topic with, we've talked about John Armstrong a little bit. I would like to point out, actually, during the War of 1812, we go through 3 Secretary of Wars. The first one is William Eustis, who is, Eustis is sounds very similar to useless. So
yes, thank you. Yes,
that pretty much sums up what he micromanaged too much and was completely overwhelmed by trying to manage a wartime army. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure he himself just threw up his hands and quit. And then Armstrong had actually been a commissioned general in the army, and then Madison tapped him to do the job. And as much as he did very little to prepare the Chesapeake Bay Theater for a larger British force, which resulted, of course, in DC turning crispy, he did do a better job than Eustis. Then James Monroe comes in and fills both shoes. So Armstrong definitely gets some deserves some flack for that. We've already brought up Cockburn Coburn, who even some of his officers actually commented that we seem to be burning a lot of houses, because there was one officer, I think his name was Gleig, I think.
Gleig,
Yeah, Gleig.
Great memoir.
I believe it was him who commented, we're supposed to go off and burn anything that's an armory or an arsenal or whatever. And they come across a farmhouse with a duck gun in it, and they're like, "Oh, it's an arsenal, burn it." And he's just kind of thinking, this isn't cool, man. But of course he's heavily outranked, so he follows his orders and goes on. But another less well-known, he's not as like powerful a villain, so to speak, but kind of a slippery character that's worth bringing up and that I love just kind of trashing on is James Wilkinson. U.S. Army general.
Yes.
He was receiving payments from the government of Spain to send them information on the United States, which he apparently didn't provide a whole lot. He mostly just liked getting the money. He was involved with Aaron Burr's big conspiracy to form a new Western country, and then managed to weasel his way out of getting in trouble for that. He purposefully put the U.S. Army, when a good chunk of it was in Louisiana after the Louisiana Purchase, in this horribly disease-ridden area of Louisiana. So a good chunk of it was dying of horrible illnesses, I think because he had property near there. And he proved to be a pretty bad general on top of that.
Well, yeah, the invasion of Canada in 1813. Let's wait to invade Canada until, the fall, because October's, November in Upper Canada, beautiful.
Yeah.
And, we see this during the Revolution. We see this during the War of 1812. Anytime you have two generals that hate one another and they're responsible for combined operations, what could possibly go wrong? Yeah, so the battles of Chautauqua and Chrysler's Farm in 1813 are just, that's definitely a low point. And I would say, thank you for bringing up Wilkinson, and we'll add Hampton to that mix of villains. Now, before you steal my thunder and go on to heroes, George, I'd like to get in there and say, of course, a hero of the War of 1812 has to be George Armistead, the commander of Fort McHenry, because his successful defense of the fort saved the city of Baltimore and 50,000 people, the third largest city and port in the nation, and inspired a national anthem. I don't think it gets any better than that. Jackson may have saved the city of New Orleans, but there was no national anthem written about that. A very nice song by Johnny Horton, I'll grant you, but not quite "Oh Say Can You See."
Several good songs.
Mm-hmm.
Unless anybody wants to sing it, I'll give a few minutes if anyone wants to. Can anyone sing the? Yeah, I remember as a kid having it on cassette. I was a history nerd. My dad was a history nerd. He's like, "Oh, here's some music to Horton, that one," and then he sang the Bismarck, I think was the other one.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Everything, but so I guess let's move on to so people remember Fort McHenry. People remember the Battle of New Orleans. If there's another battle, I know we talked about a few of them already. Another engagement. I've heard someone mention River Raisin. Someone, of course, mentioned the battles on Lake Erie. It's something somebody should know, or is a site that they should visit in that area, this side of the Canadian border, since we can't go through borders yet because of the recent pandemic. So
definitely the Battle of Lake Erie, which has a national park unit attached to it, and the Battle of Lake Champlain. One is in 1813, the other is in 1814. Both of those are incredibly significant to the overall course of the war. Had either of those been lost by the United States Navy, the outcome of the war may have been very different, or certainly would have proceeded differently. Control of the Great Lakes was critical for safeguarding the United States from British invasion.
Good. Does anyone want to add another one?
I'll jump in. and then I'll throw it over to George. I'll jump in and I'm going to say the Tippecanoe battlefield in Indiana, where some historians tend to look at Tippecanoe as being one of the first engagements in what takes place in today is Indiana, the old Northwest Territory. Some historians look at Tippecanoe and William Henry Harrison's campaign in the old Northwest against Tecumseh and the Northwest tribes as sort of being the beginning of the war, so to speak, since Tecumseh really goes on to, and Harrison too, play a very prominent role throughout the course of the conflict. I think it's a forgotten battlefield to I think a certain degree, but I think from a historical perspective, if you're looking for one battlefield where the war began, Tippecanoe is probably going to be it, at least in my book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tippecanoe is definitely a big one. Probably another one I would throw out is the Battle of the Thames, or Thames if you're reading it. You're going to need to spell it out or Google it later. All the British and Canadians called it the Battle of Moravian Town. Kind of like the Civil War. We have Manassas and Bull Run. And that one, you get huge American victory. William Henry Harrison, our shortest serving president, although not there yet. Big victory. And then one of the really big things come out of that, this is kind of already started happening during his campaign to retake Detroit. But with the death of Tecumseh and the complete breakdown of British control of that chunk of Canada, you see all of these tribes start to come in, Native American tribes start to come in and negotiate these treaties with the United States that largely end up not being very favorable to them. And it's, at least for the northern half of the western part of the war, that really breaks Native American resistance to westward expansion in what were the Northwest Territories, until you start getting out into like Montana and the Dakotas. And then the kind of the southern version of that is the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Andrew Jackson, literally the native peoples of the Creek Nation, or at least a portion of them, are in a bend in the, I can't pronounce it, river, because I don't see it.
Alapusa.
Yes, that one. And they have their line across the top here, and Jackson comes in. They get stuck at the bend of the river, and it's the largest death toll of Native Americans in a single battle, from what I recall. And that basically ends the Creek War, with kind of a mini war within the War of 1812, and that opens up all kinds of things for later on when Jackson's president, the Trail of Tears, and again, further westward expansion.
It standing on the field at Horseshoe Bend is, I mean, it's the battlefield is unchanged. There's one monument in the wood line. There are two cannon, and then there are some white posts that mark where the Red Stick Creeks had erected in an entrenchment of sorts. And to stand on that field and to contemplate what happened and how the absolute destruction of the Red Stick Creeks there, ended the Creek War in the South, and how Jackson seized that moment to impose terms not just on the Red Stick faction of the Creeks, but on the peaceful Creeks that had not participated in the war, who had tried to embrace quote unquote white civilization through settling on homesteads and farming, and how he later forcibly removed them all in the Trail of Tears. I mean, it is a tiny field, and yet the impact of what happened there looms so large for the Creek Nation. It's truly humbling to stand there. So absolutely, if you can ever get down to Horseshoe Bend in Alabama, do it.
Another national park.
Yes, amazing. You have pristine.
That's one of the, so Mark Malloy has commented, what is the best battlefield to visit? So is it Horseshoe Bend? This is most pristine, original location. To Fort McHenry because of the Star Spangled Banner. Is it Chalmette, so you can actually see steamboats rising above you down the Mississippi?
I think maybe the easiest way to answer that is, what's the most disappointing? The two most disappointing battlefields to visit are two of the largest battles of the war, and one of them is Chalmette and Line Jackson, because you're standing there. It's Line Jackson. This is the Battle of New Orleans, and then you look up and off to the right, and you see the levee and the ships going by, and it's odd.
Yeah.
And then the Battle of Lundy's Lane, which was a brutal, nasty, knockdown, drag out fight, muzzle to muzzle, in the dark, in echo of Niagara, or in earshot of Niagara Falls. It's gone. It's like the red light district for Niagara Falls. It's really sad. Basically, Lundy's Lane is what I would say the Gettysburg of the War of 1812, and it's completely gone, completely 100%.
There's any markers or anything? I mean, just asking from personal self. I've not been up to Niagara Falls, so anything at all?
No, the best place that you can go to get any sense of it is there's a cemetery there, but it's been years since I was up there. I don't recall a marker.
They've got a little bit, as you're going up Lundy's Lane is an actual road. As you're going up it, they do have this like stone mural. And you remember going across into Canada with a friend of mine, and the Canadian border guard asked us, where are you going? And we were like, oh, and of course, we being the history nerds we are, Niagara Falls doesn't get mentioned once. We're like, oh, we're going to go to Fort Erie and Lundy's Lane. He's like, why are you going to Lundy's Lane?
Yep.
Because he had no idea.
Imagine going to Gettysburg and driving down Emmitsburg Road, and you're headed into town, and on the right-hand side, where the high water mark is, it's just wall-to-wall buildings, and it's a red light district, essentially, and run down. And then to the left is more of it with the cemetery kind of broken up in there. I mean, that is the equivalent of Lundy's Lane. It's heartbreaking.
There is a nice monument in the cemetery for the British soldiers of the battle, and it is up on a hill, which is where a lot of the ugly fighting took place. So you are on the site. I believe some of the soldiers from there are buried in that cemetery. And you do get a nice view from up there, but a lot of what you're seeing are people's backyards, this red light district, and more camouflage than I ever thought I would see outside Kentucky. And
since we have Dan Davis on the call, I'm going to throw out my pitch here. One of the best preserved battlefields of the War of 1812 is actually on the eastern shore. It's Caulk's Field.
Yep.
Very
familiar with Caulk's Field.
Spider-Man, Sir Peter Parker, that was actually his name. He was the captain of the HS Menelaus. He led some British Royal Marines and sailors on a night attack against a militia encampment, which was around the Caulk House. And the battle took place literally around 11, 12 a.m., 1 o'clock in the morning. A lot of confusion. Both sides claimed that they won. Basically, both sides kind of ran out of ammunition and then withdrew. Peter Parker is killed. But there was artillery, a nice stand-up fight there for about an hour, and it's pristine. I mean, you go there on the eastern shore, the Caulk House looks exactly like it did in 1815. Farm fields all around. So Dan, if the American Battlefield Trust can get in there and get some easements or something, that would be amazing. It is probably the most pristine battlefield of the War of 1812.
Yeah, I am very familiar with Caulk's Field. There is a nice monument there.
Awesome. Yes.
And the shame about the thing that kind of is disappointing about Caulk's Field, as Jim mentioned, is very well preserved. Looks just like it did at the time of the battle. But at the same time, it's a very, very small American victory in the midst of all this chaos. As you know, after the British have essentially for the last 2 to 3 years have been running roughshod through the Chesapeake region. They burned Havre de Grace. They burned obviously Washington. They've chased President Madison out of the Capitol, and it's this tiny little American victory that nobody ever talks about because it gets sandwiched in with the burning of Washington and then the great event in Baltimore with the defense of Fort McHenry.
I have to throw this out. Is this the same Peter Parker of the American Revolution as well? Is this the same naval guy who went into Charleston?
No.
Okay.
He's a young man. I'm trying to think. I don't quote me on this, but I think he's in his early 30s, late 20s.
Yeah. I think
George knows, right, George?
I think he had it was either his father or his uncle or something that was like this big admiral, like Sir Hyde Parker or something like that.
I thought there was a Peter Parker or something in the 1776. The
There's
first.
probably a connection.
Yeah, there's a there. Yeah.
He was Sir Peter Parker, so.
I just didn't know. I mean, I know he's not Spider-Man, but other than that, I didn't know what the connection was. So one of the things that I want to throw this out, and I've heard is about the burning of Washington. Obviously, they come in. There's rumors about whether it's retribution for the burning of York and by American forces, or whether that the British weren't going to touch civilian things until somebody took a pot shot at the British lines. Can we bust this myth open? What is it? Does either any of the historians here know exactly what happened when Robert Ross's men marched down into D.C.? Is it provoked, or is it just the fruits of conquest?
So my own take is, well, one, York gets thrown around a lot. Less well-known one that the British also brought up a lot was the burning of Newark, or
Yep.
Newark if you're from New Jersey, I guess, which is this community that outside of Fort George in Canada, which the Americans were occupying. The American commander there abandoned the fort, turned out all the families in the middle of a Canadian winter. And having lived up on the Great Lakes for 6 years, it gets cold. And just turn them out of their houses and burn the town. The British were calling that for retribution. However, I am also inclined to think that based on, that may have been, some of the official stuff, but also, and Jim, please jump in, but with the amount of burning Coburn seemed to enjoy doing, or Coburn, up through the Chesapeake, I don't think he needed much of an excuse to go start the DC barbecue there. He was ready and raring to go, and these provided convenient excuses and cover.
Well, so a couple things. One, Coburn was not the commanding admiral in the Chesapeake Bay in August of 1814 when the burning of Washington took place. That was Sir Alexander Cochrane. And Cochrane had shared with Ross communications that he had been getting from high command about Newark and York, and basically had told Ross that the gloves are coming off, right? This isn't a time to be overly gentlemanly, if you will. Cochrane wanted to lay a heavy hand and a decisive hand, if possible. So when Ross is marching to Washington, he's got Cockburn there as kind of the eyes and ears of the Navy. So when the Army's on board the fleet, the Navy's in charge. When the Army's on land, the Army or Ross is in charge. But Coburn's going there to kind of whisper into Ross's ear and make sure he doesn't do anything untoward, or in this case, back out, which he thought about doing, not once but twice, over two different nights. And Coburn took Ross aside and kind of walked with him and convinced him, hey, I've been in the Chesapeake Bay for the whole summer of 1813 and most of 1814, and I can go wherever I want and do whatever I want. There's no American army that's going to suddenly pop out and keep us from getting into Washington, D.C. We can do this. So you get the sense, and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, but you get the sense that Coburn and Cockburn had in mind this operation against Washington early in 1814, based off of his previous experience. Ross pushes the army. When they engage the Americans at Bladensburg, he only engages the American army with a third of his force. It's actually a very reckless attack against a numerically superior foe. Fortunately for Ross, he's victorious. I think when they march into Washington, you have to keep in mind Ross's words are ringing with Cochrane's admonition to lay a heavy hand, Coburn's constant whispering, we can do this. He's just fought a battle he was lucky to have won, and he suffered a lot of casualties. He's been actively campaigning in the field for several days. He's exhausted. Everyone's dehydrated. They're marching into Washington. A couple people take some pot shots at him. If he didn't have it in mind to start torching at that point, probably the exhaustion and the synergy of all that stuff in the moment led to the decision.
So to relate,
it's interesting just to add on to that and just put it into perspective. It's really Cocker and Coburn. I think they're looking for that knockout blow to the American psyche, that knockout punch that really turns the tables from a diplomatic standpoint, from a military standpoint, in the direction of the British. And from an American perspective too, it's the second time in 37 years that a British army has marched into and occupied a capital of the United States. And I think that kind of gets lost as well, that, for the second time in 2 wars and a little under 40 years that a British army occupies an American capital.
That's a very good point, Dan. And one thing that I have yet to see in anything written about the burning of Washington and the War of 1812 is a discussion about how Madison reacted to this by not doing something. So Madison often takes it on the nose for being a weak president. What I find very fascinating is he has the power to basically invoke the 1807 Insurrection Act, suspend habeas corpus. He could have done what Jackson did in New Orleans. He could have done what Abraham Lincoln will do in 1861. There is a foreign army marching at will through Maryland, laying waste to the capital of the United States, and yet James Madison does not suspend the writ of habeas corpus or declare martial law. So all of you out there listening, if you are currently in school and looking for a bachelor or master's thesis, that's it.
there it is.
What's also interesting to that is that, after Madison, the First Lady, eventually evacuate the capital, what I find interesting is that within days, the First Lady of the United States, Dolly Madison, and we're talking 3-4 days, she's back in Washington, D.C. She's just staying at the executive mansion. She's staying, I believe, at her sister's home. But I find it interesting that how just we look at this, the burning of Washington, the occupying of Washington by the British Army is just this almost a seminal event in the War of 1812. But at the time, it's very nonchalantly, people are coming back into the city very, very quickly after the British leave.
Well, there was kind of a revolt in Congress. A lot of congressmen wanted to take this opportunity to get the capital out of that godforsaken swamp of D.C. and move it back to New York. But Madison's leadership and his steady hand after the burning prevented that. Yeah.
So we,
a lot of amazing moments during the war. It's a very small war, a lot of very small battles, and yet with far-reaching consequences.
So we have a question. So we brought up Dolly Madison. We have a few questions about Dolly. Is she one of the unsung heroes of the War of 1812? Did she actually save some of the items in the White House? Is there a good story behind that? Of course, we always hear her saving the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington, but she didn't save dinner. Apparently, dinner stayed on the table, evacuated. What is there any truth? And should we rate Dolly Madison up there in the list of great first ladies? Anybody?
Well, Dolly Madison, I forget the details of the story, so I'm not going to get too much in depth of it. But I have heard it said that it was actually one of the Madison's enslaved people who actually is the one who sewed the Gilbert Stuart painting, but I don't know the details, so I'm not going to delve into that one too much. If either of you two know it, please jump in. But I think Dolly deserves kind of a little more credit, not for just saving one painting, but actually being James Madison is not the most sociable of people. He's a nerd, bit of a dweeb. Dolly Madison is not. She's a socialite. So if you need schmoozing done, Dolly throws a big party, invites the big wigs, and be like, hey, you should listen to my incredibly intelligent and very diminutive husband here and hear what he has to say, and then I'll explain it in normal people speak later, have some wine, vote for whatever he wants. I'm exaggerating a little bit there, but that's kind of the gist of a big role she played. She's the one doing a lot of the more like socializing, getting people together.
She was the social center of Washington, D.C. during the Madison administration, no question. And she, many historians, will say that she basically invented the role of the First Lady. And you have to also keep in mind what Washington, D.C. was like and what it looked like back during this time period. It's not much at all. There's really nothing else to do. And so everyone wants an invitation to a soiree hosted by Dolly Madison. Interesting side note, Dolly's favorite ice cream, oyster ice cream. We actually made it at Fort McHenry. I did not try it. Several colleagues did, and they did confirm that it is as disgusting as it sounds. However, in 1814, oyster ice cream was all the rage.
Oyster ice cream. So there we go. I never thought we'd be adding oyster and ice cream to Rev War Revelry. So you never know where these are going to go. As we tend to get closer to the end here, there's a few questions I want to ask, and some of our comments as well is, I guess we kind of answered this already, the lasting impact of the War of 1812. We'll kind of skip that, but since we all are, you can see, besides Dan, and I know he has an extensive library, you can all see books behind us. There's one book someone should pick up on the War of 1812, and I recently picked up William Davis's new one about the Battle of New Orleans. Is there one book someone should pick up on the War of 1812?
Civil War of 1812 by Alan Taylor.
That's a great one. And to Phil's point, I actually got through not too long ago William C. Davis's book on New Orleans. It's excellent. Highly recommend it. I would probably, if you're looking for sort of a good high-level overview that you can get through in probably 4 or 5 days, say a work week, I would say Walter Borneman's War of 1812 is a good starter.
Kind of a similar vein to that, Don Hickey's book on the War of 1812 is a great one. If you're just going to read one book and then move on from it, that's a good one. Gives a good overview. If you want the more in-depth military stuff, John Mann's book is also good, although it's dated. It came out in the 70s, but it's solid overview. If you live in the Chesapeake Bay area, another Alan Taylor book you should read is The Internal Enemy. It is in my office at Harper Stereo. It looks like Jim's pointing out. Yes, that is an excellent book.
Very good.
It deals with the Chesapeake Bay and it focuses on a lot of African American history, but definitely worth getting a very good sense of what's going on in the Chesapeake Bay, Virginia especially, but also can be said also DC and Maryland.
Yeah, and
another good book is The Perilous Fight.
Yeah.
That covers the Battle of Baltimore and the destruction of Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and I'll throw out one more that is written by an author that I think many of us know more from his books on the American Revolution. That's John Buchanan's Jackson's Way, Andrew Jackson and People of the Western Waters. And Buchanan takes Jackson pretty much from his birth all the way up to and after, just directly after the Battle of New Orleans. It does a really good job covering Andrew Jackson during that time frame. And again, John Buchanan is one of the preeminent American Revolution historians out there.
So I held up Alan Taylor's The Civil War of 1812, but I didn't make my pitch. So I'm gonna do that now. Here's why all the books that have been mentioned should be in your library, and you should read them. And I will admit that the Civil War of 1812, it's not a traditional narrative history of a campaign or a battle. It can be a little heavy at times. But here's why I think it is the superior book at the moment on the War of 1812. And that is because it basically begins at the close of the American Revolution. And it links the American Revolution to the War of 1812 and how the War of 1812 is the result of what is an unfinished conflict, right? After Yorktown in 81 and the Treaty of Paris in 83, we think, oh, great, okay, we go on, we create a constitution, we elect a president, and things are grand. And the War of 1812 takes place because of the Napoleonic Wars. Well, it's as I think George said, a slow burn. All of these issues that are not addressed by the Treaty of Paris, all of these issues that linger in the American psyche. How can the United States, with its understanding and version of democracy, peacefully coexist with the British colony of Canada to the north with their different version of democracy? How is that possible? And Taylor walks through that. And he also shows that as a very young nation, there are a lot of internal divisions, and how you see Americans settling in Canada that are going to fight against their old nation. Irish immigrants on both sides that are going to end up, you literally have brother fighting brother in some instances. And so you can see during the War of 1812, and also in his book, The Internal Enemy, the sectional conflict, the seeds of the American Civil War that come later on. So yeah, I think Taylor's book is great because he talks about how the War of 1812 hinges on this key concept of the Republic's citizen and the king's subject, and how the issues that led to the War of 1812, specifically impressment, that every time the British forcibly removed an American citizen off the deck of an American ship, an Irish immigrant who had been born, say, in Ulster and settled in New York, the British are saying that that British subject does not have the right to become an American citizen. And in a way, by seizing that man, it's an act of counter-revolution. And by defending that individual's right to leave Great Britain and come to the United States and become a citizen, we are in effect reenacting the American Revolution, which was so interesting to me that even right after the American Revolution, that Americans were or could be thinking in those terms.
Oh, that's I've actually got both of those books on my bookshelf that I literally just put up. For those who don't know, for the last few weeks I've had a white wall behind me, and I've been blasted by everyone on Revelry because I didn't have a library up. But now I have my library up behind me. Now I just need to start reading some of the new editions. Amazon has been not my best friend during this recent pandemic. But as we near the end here, I'd like to wrap up. If there's a final point that everyone would want to make from the War of 1812, something we didn't cover, something we should maybe cover in the next Revelry, if we can entice you guys to sully your reputations again by being part of this the group. But so I'll start. George is on my top left, so we'll do George the best first there. So George, take it away. One final point about the War of 1812.
So I think, a lot of what we've been saying, kind of, I think what I hope everyone watching kind of takes away from this is that this is a far more important conflict than your high school textbook would lead you to believe, with its one-line mention of Fort McHenry in New Orleans, zip, 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 slavery, Civil War, yay. And although, like I said earlier, although it doesn't have as clear cut of the causes take a lot longer to list off and the effects take a lot longer to list off, they are incredibly significant. And also, something we haven't really brought up is that although its memory in modern American psyche is kind of faded away to New Orleans and the Star Spangled Banner, for most of the 19th century, it is a big part of what Americans look back to. They refer to the veterans of 76 along with the veterans of 1812 and their toasts on the 4th of July. They have tons of course, the veterans are still alive for a good chunk of that, but it does play this huge role in how Americans kind of talked about it. And what we can argue whether it really was or not, but Americans at the time definitely, and they use this language, saw it as a second American Revolution, or at least finishing that first one and kind of establishing we are independent and we will do our own thing, and then look west, and then we get Go West Young Man, and that has its own consequences. A lot of bad, some good, and we end up sea to shining sea, for better or worse. And a lot of that, I think, begins June 18th, 1812. So actually, just a few days from now, we're getting to the anniversary. You should read a book on 1812. On I think it's just a few days from now. Yeah.
They start running together, right? So, Jim, Dan, either you two want to jump in next here?
Yeah, I'll just tag on a little bit to what George said. And the War of 1812 to me is the United States is this young nation. It's finally starting to step out on its own. It takes two wars, but it steps out from the shadow of Big Brother Great Britain. And after the war, the United States is the United States. There's this often quoted line from a newspaper shortly after the end of the war said that the newspaper editor comments, "Who would not want to be an American?" I think the War of 1812 symbolizes the United States coming into its own and stepping out for the first time onto not national but an international stage.
Jim?
All right.
Ditto? No.
So I think what I would like to see a topic of this moving forward would be a stronger connection or examination of the Rev War to the War of 1812. And I look at, a lot of historians would say that, the revolution, to understand the revolution, obviously you have to go back and you have to look at the French and Indian War. And if the French and Indian War starts in 1754, you look at the end of the War of 1812, 60 years later, as kind of the coda to the conflict that began back when we were still colonies and fighting the French. All three of those conflicts accomplish specific ends and then leave certain threads that aren't tied up very neatly. Certainly for the institution of slavery, the War of 1812, specifically in the Chesapeake, is fraught with consequences. 4,000 individuals, escape and gain their freedom, and yet those who remain are faced with the white fear that exists after the War of 1812, where the British so vividly showed that a foreign force, coming into the country would have people who would be very willing to show them how to get around and attack. I think states like Virginia and Georgia specifically, who felt the hand of the British the hardest in this regard, they called out to the federal government repeatedly for aid and none came. No federal troops, no U.S. warships. So for Virginia and Georgia in particular, the War of 1812, the object lesson there was you can't rely on the federal government. They're not going to protect you physically. And then as they saw, enslaved individuals as property, they're not going to protect our property. So the War of 1812 in that respect sharpened the sectional divide that would later explode into the Civil War. And then for Native Americans, if the United States wants to claim that it won the war and the British wants to claim that they don't remember the War of 1812, the Native Americans certainly lost. Both the Tecumseh Confederacy in the north and the west, and the Red Stick Creeks in the south. The War of 1812 broke the back of any Native American resistance east of the Mississippi and ushered in multiple new states, two of which were Alabama and Mississippi. We've already talked about the professional military, and then Dan very rightly pointed out this new sense of American unity. I think that, when you look at all of the Union imagery in 1861, defend the Union, rush to preserve the Union. This concept, this idea of union is not something that dates necessarily back to 1776 or 1781, but more recently to 1814 and to 1815. And so that's the irony of the War of 1812, I think, is that you see the sectional differences hardening and becoming sharper in focus. At the same time, you see this overarching idea of union coming into play.
Sure. Now I'll try to jump in with my limited knowledge here on the War of 1812. You do see that American identity, and I'm always looking for like parallels or connections. I mean, out of the War of 1812, I mean, you have shortly after James Monroe, the era of good feelings. You have, I think Monroe is one elector away from becoming unanimously elected. I think it's someone in the New England states voted for someone else. But you also, Jim was saying, you have that first, the Missouri Compromise, 1820. You start seeing the American identity, the Native American or the Indian Removal Acts that will come. So we remember all these things, but we don't remember the War of 1812 specifically, but remember what kind of came out of this engagement as well. Obviously, too, if growing up a little bit in Europe, it's, England might have forgotten about it because they're dealing with this little Frenchman that was running around Europe at the time, Napoleon. And I've been to Waterloo and so forth. That happens, and you see parallels from both sides of the Atlantic. But we definitely talked more about what our textbooks. I remember in elementary, middle, high school, it was only Fort McHenry and Andrew Jackson. For a while, I think both of them were at the same place. So I'm glad we unpacked that here in the last hour. But with that, I'd like to thank all you gentlemen for joining us here on Rev War Revelry. This is the RW Roundtable with Emerging Rev War. We'll be back next Sunday with a topic undisclosed yet, but sounds like we should probably do another one on the War of 1812, at least the connections between the American Revolution and the War of 1812 itself. So for George, Jim, and Dan, thank you, gentlemen, for giving up time on your Sunday to talk about this war. Thanks for giving us books to add to the bookshelves that are behind us. And so with that, we are signing off. We'll see you next Sunday. And thanks again for joining us here on Rev War Revelry.